Who do we look to shape our world? It'll be people who know how to think with their heads and their hearts. People who contribute with compassion, courage, confidence. People who understand that faith is not the enemy of education, but its partner. Tomorrow's difference makers and world changers will understand they are part of something bigger, an unstoppable force for good. More than book smart, more than business smart, they're wise in their whole being. These are the people who will shape our future, and you'll find them at OBU today.
I am a future shaper.
I'm a future shaper.
We are future shapers. Learn to live well and lead well in God's world. Be a future shaper at OBU.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Big Place, I got to get that right, Big Gospel, Small Places conversation. You don't want to get that backwards. And I'm glad you can be here and join us today. We have a few people still coming on. They keep rolling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm thankful that you can be here today and join with us. And we're just going to be talking about the strategic value of small towns, how we can best reach them, and a lot more. My name is Luke Holmes. I'm pastor at First Baptist Tishomingo, Oklahoma. We're located right between Ravia and Milburn, if that helps you. And I'm really excited for this conversation today. I think it's important. I grew up in a big city, but I've really come to love small towns and the ministry that happens here. And thank you for joining us today. You know, a year ago, a conversation like this might have seemed strange, but it's the new normal. And now I'm thankful for the people who have joined us today from all over. So in just a minute, we'll get to introduction of our panelists, but I want to give some thanks to our sponsors. The Small Places Big Gospel conversation is brought to you by Oklahoma Pastor Renewal. This was started by a group of friends to provide resources and more specifically, help to rural churches and pastors. Our tagline is Pastors Helping Pastors, because who better to know what pastors need than those who are in the midst and the thick of ministry. And so I'm glad that all of the men on our panel have served or are serving as pastors in small places. If you want more information about Oklahoma Pastor Renewal, you can join our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter. And today would definitely not be possible without the Hobbs College of Theology and Ministry, Oklahoma Baptist University, that you just saw that video for. Dean Matt Emerson and his staff, they're training future pastors and leaders in Oklahoma and sending them out all over the world. We're proud to partner with them and have them sponsor this conversation today. The Hobbs College of Theology and Ministry exists to empower and inspire future leaders for kingdom impact, and their mission is to inspire and equip students for Christ-centered, transformational, practical leadership and ministry. They shape leaders with the knowledge and skills necessary to transform the world for Christ and his kingdom. Now, if you don't know about Hobbs College or OBU, you can go to okbu.edu to learn more. If that doesn't work, you can find Dr. Matt Emerson on Twitter. Ask him to answer tough theological questions in 280 characters. He really loves that. And but now on to our introductions. I'm going to stop talking, and we're still waiting on a couple of panelists, but I'm going to let Steve and Witmer go first. Stephen, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about your ministry and where you are.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Great to be with you all. My name is Stephen Witmer, and I'm one of the pastors at Pepperell Christian Fellowship, a non-denominational church in the town of Pepperell, Massachusetts. We're a town of about 12,000 people, an hour or so northwest of Boston, and about 5 or 10 minutes from the New Hampshire border. I've been here at my church for almost exactly 13 years. And so I've been doing small town ministry as a pastor for that length of time. And I grew up as the son of a very small town pastor in north central Maine. My dad pastored for more than 30 years in a town of about 700 people on the Appalachian Trail, right on the edge of the 100-mile wilderness. 100 miles of wilderness between our town when I was growing up and Mount Katahdin, the end of the Appalachian Trail. So a lot of my life has been spent in small towns and doing small town ministry. Thrilled to be with you all. It's a privilege.
That's good. Also with us today is Matt Henslee. Matt, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about your ministry?
Well, first of all, Luke, I was wondering if you were going to finish that line earlier and say like big town, small gospel or something. That was what I was really wondering about. But it is good to be here. My name is Matt Henslee. I'm the pastor of Mayhill Baptist Church in Mayhill, New Mexico, a town of about, I think, 60 people in our incorporated area or the area right around the post office. We're not really an official town, as it were. But I've been here a little over 4 years now, having a great blast here and serving the Lord with my wife, Rebecca, and our 4 daughters. And some of them are teenagers, some of them are about to be teenagers. So everybody that's listening in can please pray for me at all times and in all ways. We will take all the prayers we can get.
For sure, I understand that. I have a 14-year-old myself and one who's 12 and 6. I have 3 daughters also, Matt. I can feel that. I can feel that pain for sure.
You can hear my pain. Like you can just hear it in the house at times. So ours
Yes.
are, let's see, 14, 12, 11, and 10, all girls. And the house is never quiet.
No, I'm sure you have nothing to do with that though. I'm thankful for you two for joining us today, and I'm especially thankful to you, Stephen, for your book that inspired this inspired this conversation. I encourage you all to get a copy. I'm sharing a link to that there in the chat, and you can go and pick that up. But Stephen, tell us a little bit about what led you to write the book and why you felt that there was a need for that.
Yeah, I said earlier, I've been a pastor for coming up on 13 years in my small town. And I think probably about 6 or 7 years ago, I just started to think more, become a bit more self-aware about the nature of my ministry and the location of my ministry. I went looking for books on small town or rural ministry and just did not find a lot several years ago. There's maybe like 1 or 2. I think over the years, I had just increasingly felt, all the things that all of us feel in ministry, just whether it's in urban or suburban or rural ministry, feeling often inadequate, feeling like at the end of my rope sometimes, confused, the challenge of weekly preaching and all these things, but also seeing opportunities in my town and really falling in love with my church in my town. And on the other side, sometimes just feeling lonely or disconnected or isolated. Also aware of the kind of evangelical narrative where to be really successful, you should be in a big place, in a big church, influencing influencers. And so all those thoughts and struggles and opportunities and joys of ministry were floating around. And several years ago, I just felt like, hey, I've worked through a lot myself. I've also done some digging in the Bible to try to understand, is what I'm doing worth it? And I've decided, yes, I think it is. And so it might be helpful to share that with some other folks, especially because at the time, there was not all that much written specifically for rural pastors or small town pastors. So I'd say I wrote the book out of an overflow of my own struggle and some victories and searching of the scriptures.
That's great. I'm putting forward a poll, if I can know how to do this, to see how big for our attendees, how big is the town that you serve in? 1 to 500, that's a big difference. And we see it come and in there. And I had a guy I met at the Southern Baptist Convention somewhere, and he said he was from a very small town. And I said, how small? He said, oh, very small, just 20,000 people. I said, well, come with me, brother. I got some places to take you. I said, come, you come with me and I will show you small. And small is a relative word, and those things kind of change back and forth. But you tell me, Stephen, you wrote about this. Why do you think small places matter? What's the importance of small places?
Well, I mean, probably the most fundamental basic answer is small places matter because people live in small places and people matter. And so it doesn't really, it does, the size of your community uh, is fundamentally not relevant to its worth. God values small places. Jesus, the Son of God, had 33 or so years to live on earth, and he spent most of those years in tiny little communities of maybe 500 to 300, 400 people. After he was raised from the dead and ascended into heaven, strikingly, he continued to identify himself as a small town man. So when he appeared to Saul on the Damascus road, he said, "I am Jesus of Nazareth," this little tiny insignificant community. So Jesus does not transcend small places. He continues to identify himself with his little hometown. And these places matter. I think they have been overlooked and forgotten, often marginalized, often misunderstood. Either they've been kind of seen as kind of perfect little communities where there's no need, or they've been seen as backwaters where you wouldn't want to waste your life. And neither of those are true. I try to say in the book that small places are better than we think, and they're worse than we think. They're better than we think when we write them off as totally valueless. They're worse than we think when we idealize them and say, "Oh, these places are perfect. There's nothing bad going down there. Let's go to where the serious need is, to the cities." Neither of those things are true. God knows them. God sees them. God loves them. So that's why we should too.
I think that's a great point. And that's a great point about Jesus still identifying himself from Nazareth. People, when you're from a small town, there's some people who like being from a small town and some people who try to avoid it for all they can, right? They want everybody to know that they've moved on, but that's encouraging to know that Jesus still identifies himself that way. Matt, what do you think are some of the myths about small towns, about kind of lies people in small towns say about small towns and maybe people in big towns too? And how does that affect us as we minister?
Yeah, I think perhaps, especially in New Mexico and in small towns that I was in Texas, I think this idea that everybody's just a hick country bumpkin that doesn't know anything and can't make it in the real world. So, he's just hanging out here in the middle of nowhere, or, maybe distrust of government. So they're trying to live off the land, that kind of deal. That's some of what I have typically heard. And I think the biggest myth, though, to kind of carry on what Stephen was saying, is when I've shared with somebody that I'm going to X, in this case, Mayhill, or previously a small town outside of San Antonio. And it was like, why? It was always this idea of,
Right.
Why would you waste your time there? You need to be moving up. You're a great preacher, or whatever it is. There's more influence that you can have elsewhere. And I think that's one of the neat things, perhaps, of social media, internet, all of that kind of stuff, is even here in the absolute middle of nowhere, with a little bit of Wi-Fi, you can still reach the entire globe, really, with the gospel. And so that's been something for me. Is the myths that I've heard is like they're all ignorant, hicks, guns on their hips. Now a lot of our guys do have that. One's right. A lot of our guys do have the guns on their hips, but for the most part, everything else has been a myth. We've got people here that were engineers, and they moved to the small town to kind of get out of just the speed of urban life, or this suburban crawl, that kind of deal. So they get out here, get some land, and do that sort of thing. We've got former professors in our town. And so really, in that sense, probably the biggest myth that I've seen busted, at least here, every town's going to be different, but at least here, has been, they don't know anything, they're a waste of your time. You don't need to be going there. And so that's the biggest myth for me.
Yeah, I think that's all definitely true. We do have a guy in our town who consistently refers to our town as Mayberry, that this is just Mayberry, and it just drives me crazy every time he does that. We do have a question in the chat, and that makes me think, as we're going through, guys, don't be afraid to ask questions in the chat. I know Cal, he's never afraid to ask a question. And he's asking about the size of a small town. You see in their poll results, most people are from a small town of under 500, and that is a small town. How would you define a small or rural place, Stephen? What would you say is the upper limit? I think we know the lower limit, but
Yeah.
is it more about population or mindset, or
Yeah.
how would you define that?
I wanted to defer first to Matt about the sweet paneling question in his office.
Yeah, so first of all, I have no idea. This is actually our parsonage, and what's cool about it, it's the exact same paneling that I had in my house growing up, and so that's been like I can see the exact same patterns and everything else. So it's a little taste of home here, 9 hours away from my mom and dad's house. And so where you can get it, you can come and take it off my walls if you would like.
That's great. A great answer. Yeah, Cal, I appreciate the question. I've actually thought a lot about this and kind of wrestled with it, and I'll give you a short answer. And yeah, Luke mentioned this is the book I've written, and I talk about that I think it's the first chapter early on in the book for a kind of a good length of time. So if you want a deeper dive, you can just read some of those pages. My short answer is that rather than try to identify what exactly is a small town or what exactly is rural and what's not, I mean, it's almost an impossible question because it's inevitably going to be subjective. And why do you say 10,000 or less is a small town, or 5,000 or less, or 2,000 or less? I mean, that's just arbitrary, or population density or distance from a city or whatever. In fact, the US has numerous agencies, and I think there may be like 14 different definitions of what is urban and therefore rural, and there are no agreed upon international definitions. So rather than kind of get into that quicksand, I'd rather just think about size of place on a kind of continuum from really, really, really tiny places, like, I don't know, 10 people to the world megacities, and say, okay, there's a spectrum of small place and big place. And I think of small places as places, communities that are relatively lacking in economic and cultural influence, and often places that are forgotten. My rough and ready definition of a small place is you live in a small place if, when you introduce yourself to folks, you need to locate your community vis-a-vis another community. Matt and I were introducing ourselves to each other before this call, and we both did that. He said, I'm 5 hours from Albuquerque. I said, I'm an hour from Boston. So if you need to do that, your town is probably relatively lacking in social, economic, cultural influence. And often rurality is not just a demographic reality, it's a feel. My town of Pepperell is, it feels like a small town. It functions like a small town. We have a town hall in the middle of town. We have a gazebo in the town field. We have town meetings. There's a real rural vibe with stone fences and horse farms and fruit and vegetable stands, and we celebrate our rurality. And so part of that is, it's not just a cut and dry demographic definition. It's a more of a thick description, a feel of what a place. Now that's somewhat subjective, but I'm okay with that. And we run small town summits here in the Northeast in New England. We allow pastors and lay people to self-identify as small town pastors. If this, when we talk about this, if this helps you, if you identify as belong to a place like this, unless you're, like right in the center of Boston, maybe we'll say, okay, fine. That's good by us.
That's good. I think that's important to note that some towns are bigger, but they act like small towns, and some are not, and everything in between in that continuum. The one thing I've always defined as small town is how far away are the exit signs on the highway. When you leave Oklahoma City, you see signs for Dallas, right on the interstate. I lived in towns where there's only one exit sign, and it's right there at the exit, and that's it. It's not upcoming or anything. And so that's assuming you live on a highway at least, but that's good. Matt, tell me, what do you think are some of the tools that a pastor needs in a small town that maybe are different than are needed in a large community?
Wow, Wi-Fi, cell service, and a decently sized gas tank where you won't run out of gas between the next town. So, as you were describing like small town, I was like, I don't really know what the actual definition is, but I can guarantee Mayhill fits that definition. You know, we
And
have a cafe.
we should
But
say that Matt might drop off because it's snowing where he's at and the
yeah,
Wi-Fi goes out when the wind blows. That's also how you know you're in a small town.
this is very true, and you know, we have to get a cell extender, and so it's like even when I leave my house, texts or emails or whatever else, I won't hear anything until about 10 miles away, and then my phone just about has a heart attack. It's like, where did all of this come from, and doesn't know what to do with the cell. But so I was going to say, you know, for our case, you know, it definitely fits whatever definition is going to be out there. We at least have a cafe. It's open kind of intermittently, and a hair salon kind of out in the middle of nowhere that is open maybe once a week. I haven't figured out what their times are, so we fit that bill. But as far as tools, I think one is both a dependency on your neighbors and also independence. I know that seems to kind of be an oxymoron, but the willingness to, you know, especially coming from a big city at times, you have that idea, we've got our fences up, don't come to our house. You know, somebody knocks on the door, everybody, you know, gets silent real quick. We want to pretend we're not home. You know, here, you know, you might very well run out of sugar or eggs or milk or something important, and you don't have the ability to drive. You know, in our case, we would have to drive about an hour to get a lot of those main staple items. And so, one, you need to be independent enough to maybe have that stuff, have enough freezers where you're not having to go every other day, it seems like, to get that, but also have a relationship with those that are right near you. And that nearness might be a mile or 5 miles or up a dirt road, whatever, where you can go and either help them or get help from them. And so I think that willingness to be close to your people and not aloof, not just your church members, but your town as it is, because in a small town, in our case, 60 people or so, word is going to travel very fast. If, you know, the pastor won't talk to anybody, even if they don't go to the church, you know, you don't need to be going there. You know, pastor won't even say hi to me at the post office, you know, whatever it might be. You have to kind of, and as an introvert, I have to continually remind myself when I'm outside of my house, outside of the office, whatever it might be, that, you know, not officially, but in reality, I am kind of the community pastor. And so even if this guy doesn't go to my church, he knows that I am at that church and I am the pastor, and will very quickly say, you know, hey, he wouldn't even wave at me when I was driving by, you know, whatever it might be. And so I think some of those, really, it boils down to relationships, being able to be self-sufficient because you just kind of need to, but also willingness to go out and help the person up the road a mile, 5 miles away, or be able to help them. And then the relationships that you're going to have with people that may not even be in your church. And that was probably the hardest thing for me to just adapt to, coming from big city life, where, and I hated this about the big city, which is one thing I loved about being in a small town, was in the big city, it seemed like there were sometimes turf wars with your fellow pastors. And certainly within student ministry, there were times where I would try and reach out to other youth guys and say, hey, let's put on a, you know, kind of a community-wide Disciple Now. And I would actually have comments like, you know, hey, you know, but what if they leave our church? You know, we barely can get who we can, you know, that kind of, it was always this turf war where you reach your people, I'm going to reach my people, and don't intermingle. But here it's you have to be working together, and there's no reason for a turf war. And the pastors really do try and work together in our community. One example is, you know, most churches, especially in bigger cities or whatever, going to have that midweek prayer meeting or youth deal or kids program, whatever. In our case, it's very low income. And so we have worked together with the fellow pastors in the area and fellow churches to make sure that each of us kind of pick a night where we have that midweek service. So some are Monday, some are Tuesday, some are Wednesday, some are Thursday, some are Friday, specifically because all of us in some form feed the kids that come. And so if we're all doing it on Wednesday, that's, that's great. We reach our people, all of that, but there's those other days that some kids may not have a hot meal at home. And so we've tried to work together where each of these churches have something at night. And a lot of our kids will go to their kids will come to ours. And it's really more of a community-wide, almost kind of like like a campus of all of these different churches serving kind of their community, to reach out kind of in that dependent side of ministry.
That's good. I think that's a good point you make about the small town pastor is always on. Even when you go to the grocery store or something, you'll always see somebody. I'd been here for a year or so, and I was leaving a football game, and 4 or 5 people said to me, "It's good to see you, Pastor." And I thought, I have no idea who that is, but I better be careful what I'm saying and doing. And it's conceivable. Yeah, a pastor at a large church in the city could go to Walmart and not see anybody from his church of thousands of people. But here we can't go anywhere without seeing anybody.
Yeah, and I like to, when I do go to Walmart, put like specifically weird things in my shopping cart so that when that inevitable member that I see, it's like, what is that? Like, but yeah, there's times where when I need to pull back, where normally I would just go to the nearby, Whataburger or something like that. I can't do that here because there will be somebody that knows that I'm the pastor there or whatever. And so for me to pull back, at times I'll have to go for a bit of a drive. And usually that's what it ends up being. I'll grab something to go, just some fries and a Coke or whatever, and just go drive for a little bit. If I just need that kind of pull back time and not be quote unquote on. And because in a small town, the switch is always on. No matter where you go, you can't just be normal guy.
Whoever
you're going to be pastor so-and-so.
It's 10:30 now. Whoever had 10:30 by the time Matt would mention Whataburger, you had the over under. You get that in the bingo pool.
That was going to be my answer on you are or are not a small town, was whether or not you had a Whataburger. But I realize that's very geographically specific, and so I didn't go there. I held off as long as I could.
Stephen, what are some of Matt talked about some of that, but what are some of the peculiar pains of a small town pastor? Maybe they're different than somebody who pastors in a larger town. And how do you deal with those?
Yeah, I think some of it for me personally has been FOMO, the fear of missing out, because of the narrative that we usually hear. Sometimes it's explicit in kind of seminaries or Christian publications that if you want your life to count, you should be pastoring in a big place somewhere. Sometimes it's just implicit and under the surface. It's the things that, not just the things that are said, but the things that are not said, that not just the people who are featured, but the people who are not featured. If you look at, ministry, pastoral publications, who are the pastors being profiled? Usually it's not people like us. So we're as a evangelical subculture, we're teaching our people, our pastors, to admire. We're teaching a certain vision of success, and that vision of success probably doesn't look like the town where I pastor or the town where Matt pastors or where Luke pastors. It's a different place somewhere other than where we are. And so for me, that has been a struggle. Loneliness at times has been a struggle. In the last several years, I feel like my friendships local friendships I've always had good friends in other parts of the country, but local friendships have really increased and gone deeper and become sweeter. And so I don't feel as lonely as maybe I once did early on in the pastorate. But I'd say, that kind of does my life count? That feeling of loneliness, sometimes lack of resources. It's been harder to find collaborators because we're just more spread out, and there are fewer really like-minded people in my small town. So I see all sorts of great urban collaboration happening in Boston, and excitingly, I'm starting to experience some more of that in my small town or region. But in those early years, I wasn't. So those would be a few I've struggled with.
I think when you speak about resources, there's more than just spiritual resources. We have a hard time finding contractors to do work and finding an electrician or a plumber and just those types of things. It just, everything takes more work, it seems, in a small town to get somebody to come out here and do things and things like that. And uh, lots of people, and either of you can answer this, lots of pastors end up at small churches and that they start out there in small towns and they think, well, I'm going to move on. Is it bad to have a mindset of of seeing small towns as a stepping stone? What's kind of the danger in viewing them that way?
I'll chime in and maybe make up for mentioning Whataburger. One of my mentors has that mentality and is very open about it. Views ministry ultimately as kind of God really is sort of the CEO and has his managers here that he's moving up, and kind of like a Walmart series. We're going to try Walmart here in the middle of nowhere, then we're going to move him up to maybe the Walmart that's kind of in more of the suburbs, and we're going to move him to the big city Walmart. And so he has this mentality, in his encouraged me to have that mentality as well, that as you move up, show yourself faithful in blank, church of 50 or whatever. Then your next one needs to be a church of 100, and then 200, and then 500, and then 1,000, in that moving up mentality. And I know a number of guys that really follow that mentality, that train of thought as well. Maybe if they're not as open with it as he is, but they still have that mentality. For us, left a church that started at 30. As I was leaving, we were running a little over 100. Came here, they were running about 30 or 40 or so. And this, pastor friend of mine was like, "What are you doing? Like, I told you to go the other direction. Why are you going back down? It doesn't make any sense." And there's times where on the perhaps human side, I'm like, amen. Like, I'm ready to get some staff. Like, for crying out loud, I'm tired of being the worship leader. I'm tired of being the guy that has to do the website. I'm tired of being the guy that has to do all of the count. I need some help, that kind of deal. And so I would be willing to say it's absolutely wrong to use churches as stepping stones, whether maybe your mentality or God wants to open up a door for you to move, quote unquote, up. I don't really see that as a thing. Every church has people in it, whether it's 100 or 1,000. It doesn't mean that the church that has more people is loved more by God or anything like that. But the bigger issue that I have is when we are ultimately stepping up and just using the church as kind of a means to an end to maybe get to that big city where I can get noticed, get on the conference circuit, all of that kind of stuff. In the wake are a number of people that God loves that have now been used by many pastors that have done the exact same thing. This isn't a new thing. It's not like guys have just suddenly started coming out of seminary and say, "Hey, I'm going to go to Mayhill, then I'm going to go to Lubbock, then I'm going to go to Dallas." It's not, nobody really comes out saying that, but that's what a lot of people have been doing for decades. And you kind of go, you cut your teeth in the middle of nowhere, and then you move on to the big city. But in the wake are these churches that feel like they're second class and not worthy of a faithful pastor that is trained and loves his folks and wants to be there as long as God's going to allow him to be there. And so for me, I'm willing to say it's absolutely wrong to, and I think the key is in how you worded it, is to use that church as a stepping stone. In all of us, we're just going to have to search our heart for what that is. If God opens a door to go to blank, USA, then by all means, that may be what God is obviously calling you to do. And you aren't using your church or using it as a stepping stone. But really, if you go in and saying, "Hey, I'm going to be here an hour north of Boston. I'm going to be here 5 hours south of Albuquerque. And this is where I am going to be. And I'm going to be a Mayhillian or whatever. I don't know what you would call your townspeople, but Tushamingo, I can't even say it. But I'm going to be this town as long as God is going to let me stay here. And at some point, God is going to move me on, or I would be fine retiring here." Like, to go in with that mentality that this is my home, This is where I want our kids to be raised. This is where I want to be maybe even buried. This is where I want to marry our kids off, all of that, to go in and say, this is home. And if God has other plans, then by all means, we submit to those. But to use a church as a stepping stone, I have stronger words that maybe, since this is recording, we could talk after about.
I completely agree with Matt. I think you said that very, very well. And I think you can boil it down and make it very simple, that you cannot love a church that you're trying to get past or you're trying to get beyond. You can't love someone you are using to get somewhere to someone else. It just doesn't work. And the key is, and Matt said this, it's the call of God. So, I love small town ministry, but if God calls me to a big city, I want to be open to going to a big city. If he calls me to a smaller church in a smaller town, I want to be open to that too. And I don't know what he's going to call me to. I've known pastors who've been called from small places to big places. Tim Keller is one of them. He pastored a little church in a little town, and then God called him to Manhattan. And I'm really glad he went. I'm glad he didn't disobey that call. But I've also known pastors who have been called away from bigger churches to smaller churches. And I think there's something unique and distinctive about that particular calling, like Matt's calling. It demonstrates something of the beauty of the gospel. You almost say, well, isn't that a waste? And I would say, well, is the gospel a waste, that the Son of God came from heaven to save sinners? God's love is extravagant. It's prodigal. And when a gifted pastor like Matt goes to a smaller church, there's something gospel-licious, gospel-shaped about that move. Like it's not fully explainable apart from the gospel. And so it becomes see-through. That kind of ministry isn't just a ministry of gospel words. It's actually shaped. It has a gospel shape. And whether people know it or not, when they see that ministry, they see a real gifted, committed, diligent, fruitful pastor, and it looks like maybe he's squandering his talents. Actually, what they're seeing is a picture of the Son of God, who came and from heaven to earth and loved people and died on a cross. So absolutely, if God could call you that way, he could call you a different way. The key is you're open and sensitive to where he's leading you.
You talk in your book, Stephen, about the idea of loving God but hating the place. That kind of ties into using that as a stepping stone. Kind of expound what that means. And
yeah, I think it's when God, there are a couple of things there. One is when God calls you to a church, he calls you to the place where the church is. You can't have one without the other. So I was not looking for a small town ministry when I came here. At the time when God called us here, I would have said I was looking the opposite direction. I had really bought into that kind of bigger is better thing. And so, but God then, the call, it's too long to recount here, but our call to the church was just so crystal clear. It was a move of God. He was prompting numerous people on the search committee and in the church to call us against their better judgment even. And so, by the time it was over, we just were persuaded he was calling us to our church. And our church happens to be on Main Street in this little town. And you can't move the church to downtown Boston. So if God's calling you to a little church, it's a package deal. You get the place too. And if you get the town, you are just not in a small town, especially, probably anywhere, but in a small town, you are not going to have a successful ministry. You are not going to reach people if it's not clear that you love the place where you are. It doesn't mean you love everything about it, and it doesn't mean you don't. You need to see its deficiencies, otherwise you can't minister to it. So you don't whitewash it, and you're not naive. But if there's no sense of, people respond when they're loved. Our kids respond because we love them. And if we just lecture them all the time, or if we neglect them, there's not going to be change. And so, yeah, being called to be a pastor in any place, I think particularly in a small place, like Matt was talking about being the town's pastor. I've heard so many people talk about that. Because there are fewer people, there are fewer resources. Often we are the default. And so, yeah, it's just very, very important to love God, to love the image of God as it's worked out in the people of that place, and then to fall in love with the place. And we're going to be more effective ministers if we do.
Can I add something to that, Luke?
Yeah.
One thing that I learned by mistake, and that's usually how I learn best, is by screwing up. Is I would talk, and I love Texas, and anybody that follows me has to deal with that kind of nonsense. And early on in my time here, it was always any of my illustrations, or I would say stuff about, we'd have visitors coming from the great Republic of Texas. They, our church is better for it today. Stuff like I would, and I was totally joking. But some of my people said, hey, we love New Mexico, and we know that you love Texas. But could you maybe not do that as much? And so I said, I'll make you a deal. I'll keep Whataburger, but all the others I'll lay aside, and so we occasionally I'll throw a Whataburger joke in, but don't be the guy that comes in that compares your today church with where you were before. When I was at such and such, we saw blank, 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 blank. You're in a different church now. You're with a different family now. And though we're, extended family with that previous church, share what God is doing there. Don't be the guy that just comes in and, where I came from, we did blank, blank, and blank. Love where you're at, and don't, compare it with others. We don't do that with our kids. Hopefully it's not like I get up in the morning like, hey, Cadence, why aren't you more like Leah? We don't do that. And so why you don't do it as a pastor either, and compare your people to maybe past pastorates.
Well,
Yeah.
and for that matter, we don't like when churches do it with former pastors with us. When so-and-so is here, he did this. I'm like, well, good for him, but I'm here now. And so we can do the same thing.
Hey, can I speak real briefly?
Yeah.
Joe left a question in the chat a
Yeah.
few minutes ago.
Yes.
He said there are many small communities in our region without healthy churches, but they might be able to drive to one. What constitutes the need for a local church, and so gives us grounds to recruit church planters there? I think that's a really excellent question, very thoughtful. And, I think it probably depends on the region you're in and the way people think about their communities. Where we are in New England, I think it's really crucial, really precious that every distinct community have its own church, if possible. I think that's a great vision. And the reason I think that is because people live in communities, and communities matter. In New England, they matter very much. Often, if you're driving from one small town to another, you're driving through forest, and then you're entering the town, and there's a welcome to whatever Pepperell, or even leaving Pepperell on the other side. And so it's real clear, where you are, and communities have a distinct identity. And it might not be that way in every region of the country, but where it is, I think it is significant. It's one less barrier for drawing people to Christ and into church. If you can have a gospel expression in that local community, even if it's a tiny little community. I think a helpful way to think about small towns is they're in a circle, especially if they're remote. Folks live within the circle of that town, so there's overlap in the circle. If they go to the library, or if there's a store or a restaurant or a cafe or something, you're going to see people in multiple places. And if you have a church there, whether there's a building or not, or you're gathering in some kind of spot, it's easier to invite people, because they'll know probably other people who go to that church, rather than driving half an hour or an hour away. Also, you're more likely to be able to do life together if you're not driving to some central location where people, you're not going to see people the rest of the week, and it's going to be an hour to drive and see them. So I do think it matters greatly where we can to have gospel-centered churches that are engaged with those local communities.
Yeah, the idea, and you all please keep asking questions. We'll have time for some more here in a minute, but you talk about the circle in the book, and the idea of being a local church. I think a problem is a lot of guys see a problem in a big city and they address it. Think now, just to pull a hot button topic like CRT or something like that, critical race theory. And so they're preaching on critical race theory in Mayhill, and that just doesn't work. How can a local church be a listening church to the problems of their community? Talk to me about that, Stephen.
Yeah, we've tried a number of things in my church just to grow in being a community engaged church. We talk about being a gospel centered community engaged church. I think sometimes churches that really love the gospel or love the Bible tend to pull back away from culture, or churches that love the community tend to lose the gospel. And we want to do both of those. We want to keep the gospel central, but also stay heavily engaged in the local community. So we've done things like encouraging our folks to be involved in the community, to be aware of the needs of the community. A couple of years ago, we started a series of forums at our church where we do panels on various needs in the region and the town. So mental health or drug addiction, and we invite leaders from the community in. So we've had the fire chief, the police chief, nurses and medical workers, various folks in, and we ask them about how they see the problem. We get a chance to thank them for what they're doing, and then consider with our people how we can partner with what's already happening in order to meet the needs of the community. Just more organically encouraging our people to be living on mission in everyday life. So when they do school pickup and drop off, to talk to other parents, not just get in and out as fast as you can, or to thank teachers. Or we've had folks leave donuts for all the teachers, or just offer to pray for teachers during a rough time, or just simply say thank you for what you're doing. And there's one of our women did that a year or two ago, and the teachers started crying because it was such a stressful, painful time. So I think it's building a culture and building instincts of teaching from the pulpit too, and modeling it yourself, that you're living on mission and building relationships with people who don't know Jesus, and you're investing in the life of the community.
That's good. I think it's important to listen to and be a part of the local community, but it can be hard to feel like you belong there. This Sunday we're having a 10-year anniversary for myself, and to some people, I'm a part of the community, and to some people, I will never be a part of the community. I'll always be an outsider. Matt, and we have that question in the Q&A. Josh writes, he's going to possibly serve in a small town. How long did it take for you to become a part of the small town culture? It's pastor, and maybe practical ways to do that, to kind of, in some people, we know you never will be. You'll always be an outsider, but how can you do your best to ingratiate yourself as part of the culture?
I think it goes back to what I shared earlier of viewing, not in a prideful sense, but viewing yourself as a community pastor, that you're available not just for your people, but for anybody that needs anything. Getting to know the waitresses, getting to know the post office workers, just being a part of who they are and spending time with them. And so one, it's going to be time. Another is, like we don't have a school here, but about 14, 15 miles away is where like our girls go to school. And so it's still a small school. Like I think the biggest class, and they're all, just all together, is like 15 or 20. So it's still small, but we somehow are able to field a regular football team. And one person gets injured and the team has to forfeit the next couple of games, but we do have a football team. And so find out what do your people in your small town, what is their thing? Here it is the basketball, not the baseball, the football. It's some of that kind of stuff. Our town itself, it is a car show about twice a year that we do at different times of the year, and everybody comes out to it. For the town that I came from, it was a little local rodeo where, Jim Bob, Mark Clifton or whatever shows up and is like, hey, I'll jump on a horse and ride around some barrels. I don't care. It's like whoever had a pulse, they were as good about finding people to serve as we are in some of our churches. You got a pulse, you could be a Sunday school teacher. No, they would throw them on a bull or whatever. And so that's where people were. And so for that small town, it's finding what is kind of that small town's thing. Where are they hanging out? Where are they at? And just jump in head first into whatever that culture or that thing is. If it's the rodeo stuff, that was like the opposite of anything I cared about. But I went out and the girls started taking riding lessons. We would do the mutton busting and all that kind of stuff. And so I tried to just own that culture and be a part of it. And that's where I got to know where the folks were. And then here it's the car club, football games, whatever. Just be where the people of that community are and show that you sincerely care about what they care about, even if deep down you're like, I don't care about this at all. And as a football fan, as a sports fan, like I go and sometimes I watch it and I have to catch myself like, this isn't the time to laugh at them. They really are trying hard. Like, so cheer and be a part of that community and what they're doing.
That's good. I think that's an important part, and Stephen, part because of your book, there's been an increasing awareness in small town ministry, and Mark Clifton is joining us from a North American Mission Board, and they have an increasing emphasis on small towns. Mark, will you talk to us some about why NAM is doing that? And you're still muted, Mark. You got to unmute yourself. There we go.
I'm sorry I'm late. My town is so small, we're an hour behind everybody else. So
No.
so there you go. No, I had a little doctor's appointment this morning, and I thought I'd get out in time, and I didn't. So
I understand.
I'm in the parking lot. So I'm a little doped up too. So I'm probably going to be really good today.
Oh, good.
That'll probably be
This
great.
is good.
Anyway, I apologize. Hey, yeah, I mean, NAM, I grew up in rural areas. I was born in a town of 2,000. When we got Dollar General, we call it the mall. So that's kind of where I'm from, and that's my town. That's my people. I've served in Montreal and other large cities, but I feel good and comfortable in rural places. So I've been in NAM for a long time. I just had a conversation with Kevin one day, and I said, rural America is really unreached. There's Indiana has the numbers out there, but over 35 million people live in what we call rural America. And the vast majority of those outside of the deep South, the vast majority of those in rural America are more unchurched than people who live in the cities. And so it's a tremendous mission field. It's not like, well, we ought to be doing something for the rural areas because they deserve it. No, it's a mission field. Until we start seeing it as a mission field, we're not really going to put emphasis and energy behind it. And not out of patronage or they deserve it too, or, they need it too. It's like, no, dude, it's a mission field. And here's the cool thing. Anyway, I went to Kevin and I said, can we look at that? And he was very open to it. In fact, he and I spent a whole day together. I live here in Kansas, but I flew down to Atlanta last summer and spent a day with him. And we just prayed about it, talked about it, and came out of it. He goes, you guys can have it. So we got a great team. NAM's put a great team around me at NAM for revitalization. And they've given us that lane. And so we just started recently, but we're gonna try to change the narrative about rural America the same way we've tried to change the narrative about dying churches. Dying churches are a mission field. They're an opportunity. And so that's what we want to talk about with rural America. It's an opportunity. And I want men and women to see it as an opportunity to go plant their lives there. I want other churches in our nation to see it as a great opportunity to invest mission resources there. And I'm excited about that. So that's why that's where all this emphasis came from. Really started the first of this year was when it kind of got rolling, and we've put together. It should be out in May. It's coming really soon. It's an online resource, a resource hub for all kinds of great resources that small town rural churches can use. Everything from sermon helps to even music. The church where I'm serving is a town of 400, and we don't have any music very often live. And so we're working on how to do good worship music via video. I mean, really good, not like you just pull it off YouTube but something that really integrates. So we've been trying different things at this little church I'm at, and I've found some that my people really like. They really sing along with. It's very interactive. So we're going to pull together the best resources we can find, put them on this hub, and just put it out there for free. And so real churches can go to this hub and pull all kinds of things that we can help them with. So yeah, I'm sorry to be so late to the party, but I'm pretty excited about rural stuff and love it and love what's happening at NAM. And the first time in decades, actually, rural populations increased and some urban center populations have decreased, and that's significant too. Anyway, okay, I'm done.
No, I think, dear, no, thank you for joining us. I know it's like all of us, we're so busy all the time. You spoke about seeing small towns as a mission field, rural places, and each of you, I'd like to hear this. Matt talked some about this, about finding that town's thing, but how can you figure out, how can you see your small town with a missional mindset? And what's that look like? How can you find the best mission strategy for reaching your church? Small towns are also different. And so it's hard to find one strategy that reaches everything. I'd love to hear from each of you. How do you find the best strategy for reaching your small town?
Well, I'm doing that right now. I'm doing that right now in Linwood. It's a town of 400 people, and it's kind of cut off from everything. It's not on an interstate or anything like that. And you know, the most important thing you do is just listen and just be available. Just have a ministry of presence, especially initially. You don't try to come in and really change them or anything like that. Just be patient. You know, that church has been there since 1911. It had 3 members left when we showed up last May, a year ago this month. And it'd been there since 1911. And in 110 years, it's managed to offend every family member in the county at some point or another. And in a rural town, if you did it to my uncle 20 years ago, it's like you did it to me yesterday. So you just got to be really patient. And it's just over a long period of time, just as Matt said, showing them that you love the town, you love the community, you love them, their quirkiness, their unusualness. You don't make fun of the town, obviously. And I do think you just, you know, I go to the city council meetings and I go to the school meetings and I just try to listen for how we can help. And then I try to find any way we can to plug in and help the town. And I just say over and over, we're here to make this community know you better. That's why we're here. And I will say that we replanted the church and we launched it. And about 3 weeks ago, we've been on Facebook. You know, we meet live. I mean, this little town, I think they reached herd immunity about a year ago, so they really haven't worried about any mask or anything for a long time. But we still put it on Facebook Live anyway. And a couple of weeks ago, this elderly man in overalls came up to the church. My wife was passing out bulletins, and he took a bulletin, but he turned around and went back to his truck. And so as he was heading back to his truck, my wife said, "Yeah, can I help you?" He said, "Oh, we live down the street. We just been watching you on Facebook, and the pastor keeps referring to take a look at the bulletin. So my wife asked me to come down here and get one." So they're just checking us out, right? It takes a while, right? So it was really cool to me that they were watching. In rural town, they were watching on Facebook. But you just got to be patient and just let them find you. It's kind of like a. I shouldn't say this, but when you go into a dying church like this, it's a little bit like a feral cat. You just got to put some cream out there and just wait for them to come at their speed. You know, you can't get real noisy; you'll scare them off. So that's kind of what I'm doing. All right, it's the drugs talking. It's not me. Okay, so I'm sorry.
Revitalization churches are like feral cats. That I've heard lots of analogies, but that's a new one. I mean, it works.
On Twitter right now. Hold
I
on.
like it. Stephen and Matt, you tell me about how do you get the right strategy for your small town?
Probably my favorite definition of evangelism is from a book that was written, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so ago by Timmis and Chester. And they said it's everyday life with gospel intentionality. And that's been so helpful for me. I think that holds true whether you're in a city, a suburb, or a small town. You just do your life. And you make little choices, and you put your gospel glasses on before you go to the dump or the transfer station, or before you walk through your neighborhood for your post-dinner walk. You're not just thinking about yourself or the thing that comes next. You're thinking about the people around you. And God you think about your whole life lived on mission. It's not a coincidence. It's not random that you live exactly where you live, and that the people on either side of you, whether that's right next door or a quarter mile up the road, they live where they do. And it's not a coincidence that your kids go to school where they do or have the friends that they have. God has sent you into each of those relationships and that neighborhood and that school and to that transfer station. So you do everyday life with gospel intentionality. It's not fancy. It's not glamorous. It often seems slow, sometimes ineffective, but actually if you stick at it and you take a second to talk to a person, like Mark said, to listen to them, to come alongside them, it's amazing the relationships that can be built. And, coming back to what we were talking about earlier, people notice in the small towns. So if you have a widow who lives 2 doors down and you find ways to serve her, you don't advertise it, but people are going to notice. And they're going to say, oh, look, that guy's a pastor, and he's shoveling her driveway, or he's, I don't know, blowing the leaves off her lawn or whatever. It's good. Word's going to spread. So I think just everyday life with gospel intentionality, it's very encouraging for me, because you don't need to have a lot of degrees or a huge amount of training or incredible wisdom or incredible godliness to do that. That's within the reach of every single one of us to live life that way.
Yeah, and for me, it really kind of ties into everything we've been sharing to this point of, what's their thing, and for us, I talked about, nearby we've got the football, but here probably the closest knit community that we have is our volunteer fire department. And so early on, just going to their meetings, they were begging me to be one, and I was like, I like living. I'll be your chaplain or something. And so I've been able to do that. And so I kind of got into that community, and we would have first responders Sundays and some of that kind of stuff at the church, serving them in different ways, because that was such a close community then. And in some sense, getting, I hate kind of the terms, getting on their good side, but really see where they know that you care, you love them, you're a part of them. That then brought them to the church. They all had their friends that maybe were past firefighters or whatever. They started coming, and that became kind of our first big, addition sense of all of these firefighters starting to show up. And we would do some of the first aid trainings and some of that kind of stuff at our church. And so really that was our thing. The other one for us was, I realized that in my office, nobody came by. Which was great. It was great because I could focus, and I didn't, I've got ADD, I'm distracted, and I see Santa right below me right now. And so I'm wanting to like sit on his lap and ask for something for Christmas. But anyway, I've got ADD and all of that. So I need that kind of quiet space. But I also realized, since nobody's coming by, there's no foot traffic by the church, we're still right on the outside of town, that if nobody's going to be coming here, I've got to get to where they are. And so I would, when I get some of the tricky parts of my sermon done, maybe the outline or some of the Greek, whatever I'm working on, then I'm going to take the rest and go out. There's some benches in front of the cafe. I'll take some of my stuff out there, and I get so little done because I'm able to, I can get a little bit done, but somebody's coming through. I know that their wife just had surgery, so I can say, hey, how's so-and-so? Let's pray for her, something like that. And so they saw me outside doing my own thing, but I could be available for, like I shared earlier, kind of being that community pastor of really checking on them. And when somebody says, my wife or my husband, or you find out they had a wreck, we have a lot of wrecks up here with animal and so forth, calling them and checking on them. When it's been a year or so after their wife of 50 years has passed away, on Valentine's Day, reach out, on their anniversary, reach out, on maybe that anniversary of the death, reach out, and really taking your initiative, because like I think Luke was saying earlier, some of them will never view you as part of that community. You're always going to be that Texan that has come here to New Mexico and changing everything. But if you take the initiative, in a sense, just own it and say, I am going to be this community's pastor, and I am going to take a earnest interest in the lives of every person that lives here. It is amazing how quickly that can turn around. And for us, the growth, of course, through COVID and some of that really allowed us to maybe speed up that process of becoming that community's pastor and living intentionally during that time.
I think there's a lot of wisdom there. Really, there's, even in a small town, there's endless possibilities of groups you can be involved with. The sports team, the firefighters. I've got to know guys because I like to go to state sales and auctions. We're waiting around at the auction. I sit around and talk with this guy, and he comes to church and this and that. And but building relationships like that, especially in a small town, is slow. I've heard all three of you say something different about slowness and pace. Stephen, you write about this in the book. Talk to us about kind of the slow pace of small places and how that affects the church and how we minister, how we can learn to work with that. And I'd love to hear Matt and Mark on that too.
Yeah, I don't personally like slow very much. I like things to move quickly. COVID has been a challenge because it's in some ways we've hit pause in some of our plans for the church, and that has bothered me. So I don't naturally embrace slow, but one of the things as I just did a deeper dive into the Bible, looking for is there justification for being in small places and doing small place ministry, which is often slower. We have fewer resources, fewer people, and therefore it's often slower. One of the things that was just very encouraging to me was recognizing that the gospel itself often moves slowly. Sometimes it moves very quickly. You know, there are mass conversions, there are people groups who come to Jesus overnight, and we love those stories and we celebrate those. But very often the gospel just works itself out slowly in our lives. I mean, I can tell you areas of my life where there's an arc of 20 years of slow, painful sanctification. And sometimes you hear a great story of someone who became a Christian and God delivered them from addiction overnight, instantaneously. We love that. That's part of the power of the gospel. But God just does not always work that way. I think there's something uniquely powerful about a slow, gentle, thorough, permeating kind of gospel influence in someone's heart and soul. And so I see in that aspect of the gospel, I see permission to have a slow ministry. Not that we try to make it slow, but if we're prayed up, if we're working hard and things do not go as fast as we want them to, say, you know, we aspire to see more people coming to Christ, and we only have one or two conversions every few years, you know, that and it's not because of lack of faith, and it's not because of lack of effort, but that's just what God has given to us. Then that itself is going to exemplify, embody something in the gospel, the slowness of the gospel, the patience of God, that he doesn't give up on us because we're not moving fast enough. And I just keep coming back to this idea that the church is meant to be see-through to the gospel. That's what Ephesians 3 says. It says, the God is displaying his manifold wisdom through, Paul says, through the Jew-Gentile church. In other words, not just what that church in Ephesus is saying, but the way they are, who they are. And so a small, slow church is going to show something about the gospel that a fast, big church won't, and vice versa. So I'm not trying to privilege the small, slow church. But our culture has always privileged the big, fast church. So I'm just trying, okay, so let's make a little room here for various kinds of churches, which can display various aspects of the gospel and the wisdom of God.
Yeah, talk to me about that, Mark. You've planted in big cities, and now you're in a small town. How have you seen that slowness kind of affect what you're doing?
Well, you know, we call it tactical patience. And if you're going to be in a rural place, a small place, you got to have tactical patience. You got to be just patient tactically. That's what the word means. I mean, it's going to take a while. And there's nothing wrong with tactical patience. It's a good word. It's a good phrase. You don't have it in urban settings. I mean, in urban settings, everything's got to move quickly. I mean, if you're going to start a church in an urban setting, you got about 3 years to build traction and get going, or it's going to be really hard. If you're in a rural setting, you have 5 years for them to even begin to acknowledge your presence in town. And you're right, you're never going to be a native, and that's okay. You love them anyway. It's a different pace. And, you know, I did a thing on Monday with Mark last Monday night about small attendance. And, you know, I'm old. And as a child of the church growth movement, big time. And really, we didn't talk about, I wasn't alive, but I mean, in the 40s and 50s, 1920s and 30s, especially 1920s and 30s, when you read a lot of information, there's not a lot written about small churches, because churches weren't called small until the church growth movement came along and had to have something to compare them to. And so they were just churches. And so, a church of 100 people is not a small church. That's just crazy. It's 85, 90% of all churches in North America. So we got these guys in churches of 12, 14, 18, 13 people, and they think, well, there's something wrong with me. No, you're pretty normal across the globe. That's what God is determined to use. And I love what Stephen just said. I mean, it's a picture of the gospel. That God is patient and he is enduring. He doesn't just bolt on us, and he stays with us, and that patience in there. And, even Jesus said, wide is the gate, and many be that find it, and narrow is the gate, few there be. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised when the work is hard, because here's what I also know after 40 years of ministry in Southern Baptist life. The big stories you hear of things that just blew up and had got big, and even in small towns, you'll hear some stories in rural America of churches that grew to 500 or 600 out there in their country. Those are one-off stories. I mean, they're great stories, and we're grateful for them, but that's not the norm. That's not the way God chooses to work most of the time. And so God's choosing to work in the lives of people like me in a slow process. Again, I agree with Steve, with a lot of sanctification for ourselves, and it's just his pleasure to do that. And it causes us to rely on him, listen, and not on the results. It causes us to find our joy in the gospel and in Jesus, and not on the results. And it's a good place to be, actually. So yeah, I just think you just got to realize you're part of a normal process that God's using across North America. And I say it almost every time I speak publicly somewhere. Only eternity is going to reveal the true fruits of your labor. You're not going to find that out based on last Sunday's attendance or the growth chart for the last 4 years. It's eternity. That's going to show how your life weaved into God's perfect plan to bring redemption. And he's got you where he wants you. Just be faithful there, be tactically patient there, love the people that come your way there, and don't compare yourself to other churches and other people. You're not to do that. That is not a godly thing to do. That is a way Satan has of drawing either making you prideful that you feel better than other people, or feel defeated because you're not doing what they're doing. Don't do that, especially in the rural areas. Don't do that.
That's a really incredible observation that they never wrote about small churches because there wasn't anything to compare them to.
Right.
So much of what I read about rural churches, the way to fix the rural church is to make it like a big church, like a big city church. Matt, talk to me about kind of embracing the smallness of a small and rural church.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, we are now flickering, so I don't know if I love all of y'all when we lose power here in just a second. I love all of you. I will say that Stephen was very scriptural in his answer and holy, looking back at gospel and all that kind of stuff. As you were talking about this slowness, I was reminded of just the physical nature of losing weight. That if you drop it off like that, and I've gone from 290 pounds down to 140, and then the dissertation and COVID happened at the same time, and I got fat again. And but when you drop it fast, you can gain it fast again. And so I was thinking of just what I've seen in losing weight, getting healthy, slowly and steady, making the right decisions, all of that kind of stuff over a long span of time. I think it was Peterson that talked about a long obedience in the same direction, that as you're doing that over time, and you see that natural growth as you're intentional, as you're doing all of the right things, saying all of the right things, reaching people for Jesus, making disciples, all of that kind of stuff, and you build that kind of healthy, natural growth along the way, then that's something that when you're gone, whether you pass away or you move, whatever, it's going to have the chance of staying power. Versus if you come in and it's all built on your personality and you grow really fast and jump up to 200, 300 people. Mark was talking about some of that being one-off situations. It's also very quickly for those things that are built around a personality to be gone the moment that guy is out of there. And so I just wanted to add that, while Stephen was really holy, I was just thinking about losing weight and how I need to do that again and doing it the right way, just steady, sure, making the right decisions over a long span of time, and it's going to have a healthier result. And
I like that illustration very much. I think I'll probably steal that and use it in the future. I think that one of the saddest things is to see a small town church trying to be something it's not. It's like this kind of grotesque. It's like a little kid dressed up in some clothes that don't fit, and thinks it looks great. My favorite story of that is a friend of mine who told about he was planting a small town church years ago, and I guess the big churches he had been to had fog machines, and so he and his people decided they were going to try to set up a fog machine in their little church, and the fog machine broke, and this green goo started like oozing all over the stage. And I just thought that is it's like a metaphor. It's a picture of what happens when we try to be someone we're not. And it happens in all sorts of ways. I think it's like guys in communities of 400, 500 saying, hey, let's love our city. Like, no, you don't live in a city. You live by your co-op, you're using language that you've heard other people use. So just be comfortable being yourself. Read Lee Eklov's book, Just Like Home, where he talks about all the benefits of a little church. And Carl Vaders is really good on that too. Instead of trying to pine for something you don't have, embrace what you do have, which is unique and distinctive, and God's made it that way.
I think there's something to be said for being comfortable in your own skin. Certainly mentally healthy, it's helpful for us to do that, but I think it's also comfortable for our churches to just be comfortable in their own skin. I'm a huge baseball fan, and I think remembering that the big church, the flashy church, the small church, the missionaries overseas, whatever, we're all truly, we say it all the time, but in reality, we truly are on the same team. And a team that is this guy's hot for a while and hitting home runs out of the park, great. We sell, the whole team succeeds. And when Mark here down in Linwood starts to get hot and starts getting people on base and RBIs and all of that kind of stuff, that we celebrate. The whole team succeeds. And where I'm not just comparing myself as maybe the first baseman to the flashy center fielder or the starting pitcher to the closer, where I see that all of us doing well and healthy and comfortable in our own skin, knowing our opportunities and what we're called to do, I think the entire team does better. And so I think being comfortable in our own skin as pastors, and then our church is truly embracing whatever it is that we are, the identity that God has really given us, and the place in, whoever it was that sang the song, Our Place in the World or whatever, I think we are better for it. So
we live in a time too, where I think with social media and just in internet websites, we're just so easy. We are all the time, we're seeing other churches and other places on other sides of the country. And so that's such an important word, Matt. I think, it's all the more important because we're confronted with successes all the time.
Yeah, I think you're all absolutely right. It's just finding, being comfortable with who you are. You don't need fog machines and laser lights and all those things. You can still sing happy birthday to people during church and take up the offering for the orphans home and the little bank, like lots of churches around here do, and all those things, and just be the best of what God has called you to be. We're coming up on the end of our limit. Mark talked about what NAM's Sum is doing. Stephen, you talk about what Acts 29 is doing through their rural collective and network and those things. To talk to us about that.
Yeah, I'm not directly affiliated with Acts 29 Rural Collective. My friend David Pinkney in New Hampshire is one of the leaders of that movement, and it's just very exciting to me. They're actively planting churches in rural places around the world. There's one of the things we're doing in New England is small town summits, and we're gathering small town pastors and lay people in each of the New England states. And those are locally sourced gatherings. So we're not calling in celebrities from elsewhere to be our speakers. We're having pastors speak at those. And we've just had incredible response all around New England. I was telling someone yesterday, just the sponsoring of these gatherings is hugely encouraging to people, because we're saying, you matter. We're going to come to your town. We're going to meet in one of your churches. You're going to hear from colleagues. And we're saying, we're not going to abstract you from your context and make you fly half a country away and spend $1,000 your church won't be able to give you in order to get material that won't translate immediately to your context. So we're going to meet you where you are. And that's been incredibly helpful and encouraging. I should also say the Small Town Summits, which I help to lead, we have a website, smalltownsummits.com, and we have articles, like original articles on small town ministry there. We just started a podcast that features the stories of small town pastors, and those have been enormously encouraging. So I'd invite anyone to check out all that stuff on our website.
I have found as I began looking, there are a lot of good resources out there. They're harder to find because they're not promoted and they're not bestsellers. There are Backroad Network and all sorts of people who are doing those things like you, Small Town Summits, and what Acts 29 is doing, what Mark is doing through NAM and all that stuff. And I encourage you, for those of you watching or later, this is on YouTube, celebrate small town ministry and resources and share them with other people. Just this webinar was something I had read the book and I thought, boy, I'd love to see something on that. And nobody was doing it. So I thought, I'll just do it and we'll make it work. And now with technology, it's easy. And if we hadn't done this, we never would have learned about feral cats. And so this is worth it. There's a lot. And Matt has put something in the chat that Southwestern Seminary is putting out. Churches and seminaries and networks and other places are beginning to turn and see rural places for the mission fields that they are. And I would say if you're in a rural place, no matter how small it is, that it matters. And so I'll give each of you one last chance for parting shots, something you like to share with these rural pastors who are watching or lay leaders. Matt, why don't we start with you?
I think the first is that you matter, and certainly you've heard from the four of us and what Oklahoma is trying to do, NAM is trying to do, Acts 29 is trying to do. I hope you see that you are cared about and you truly matter. You know, we've talked a lot about, you know, these small churches, that they matter because people are there and, you know, God loves them. You matter too, and you know, sometimes you may not find yourself on, you know, Baptist Press, or, you know, none of us in this chat are probably ever going to be on the outreach.com, you know, fastest growing churches, that kind of deal. You know, there's not that kind of success. That doesn't mean that you don't matter. You know, you are loved and you are cared for. And there's groups like Acts 29 and their collective, the NAM Replanters, Oklahoma. You know, I shared the Swibbits thing. All of us really have the same goal, is to remind you that you matter, to resource you, to help you to be the best pastor you can be, the best husband you can be. You know, that's one of the things that I love about the NAM Replant blog, is there's stuff about how to deal with that angry church member, and there's also stuff to deal with your kiddos and prayer and everything else. And so just know that you matter. And it's not, you know, Luke offered each of us like $1,000 to be on here today. That's the only reason we're here. Not really. We didn't get anything. We truly love you and you matter. That would be the main thing I would share.
Great. How about you, Stephen?
Two things real quick. One is find good friends who are doing this kind of ministry and collaborate with them. It's been one of the chief joys of my life over the last 5 or 6 years. Just building deep friendships, and when you're ministering with friends and partnering together, you work harder, you have more joy, your faith grows. One of the most exciting things I'm doing right now is there's a group of 8 or 9 of us, churches and pastors around New England. We're all small town pastors. God is calling us to collaborate to plant churches together. So we are small town New England churches planting small town New England churches together. We're gonna pool resources, financial resources, and personnel, and build deep relationship and brotherhood, and then plant out of those, which means that our little churches, very unimpressive, ordinary small town churches, will, Lord willing, be planting churches every year or two together. And that's incredibly exciting. We can do that. We don't need to be in a city in order to collaborate with other churches. So find brothers and then work together. And the last thing I would say is one of my favorite stories. I was in the state of Maine a couple of years ago, and this pastor told me this story. He went to a parishioner's house. This guy was an old man. He couldn't come to church. He wasn't well enough. So my friend a pastor was going to visit him. And he got there to the guy's house, and this older man had soiled himself. He was just sitting there in his own filth. And my friend didn't know exactly what to do. He just said, okay, well, he took him into the bathroom, he cleaned him up and brought him back to the table, and they shared the Lord's Supper together. And my friend was telling me the story, and he got all teary. He said, it just felt so right. And I think, yes, it did, because the Lord's Supper is a celebration of exactly that kind of reality, of coming alongside someone in their brokenness and neediness, and there's a gospel shape to that kind of an action. And so when we as small town rural pastors live out the gospel in our places, when we serve in very humble.
Oh, we thought we were going to lose Matt, and we lost Stephen instead. Okay, you're back.
You were just saying humble.
Humble.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, when we serve in those humble ways, God's going to be honored. Our actions are going to demonstrate the very shape of the gospel, the contours of the gospel. So I just want to encourage guys to kind of do the rest of today. Do what you do for the glory of God. That's going to make much of it, no matter where you are and what it is.
Good. Mark, why don't you give us parting shots?
Yeah, when we talk about, and I spent 10 years doing replanting dying churches, as Stephen just said, the reason you replant dying churches is for the glory of God. That's why we call the book Reclaiming Glory. The reason you go into a rural community and go to a rural church or planted rural church is for God's glory, to make much of him. It's not to grow numerically, not to make a name for yourself, not to build a franchise. It's for God's glory. I'll just leave you with the hat, man. I wear the International Harvester hat everywhere I go because I like International Harvesters. I like red things better than green things, but mainly I wear it because a friend of mine, Leighton Howerton, wrote a song 20 years ago called International Harvester. And the lines in that song say that the summer is past, the harvest has come, and some still are not saved. The workers in the field are few. It's just a skeleton crew because all have not obeyed. But like a mighty combine, the master's going to come and gather the wheat from Kansas to Capernaum. And he'll reclaim the land that sin and death has won when the International Harvester comes. And so I wear the hat and I give away hats because Jesus is the International Harvester. And working in a rural community is like farming. It's hard work. It takes long hours. Tremendous unexpected things happen to you, obstacles you never dreamed of. Some years are much better than other years. Oftentimes you're really alone. It's hard on your family. But at the end of the day, you don't make the crops grow. At the end of the day, God makes the crops grow. And your work is needful in the church you're at, but it is not effectual. And that's good news to you, that Jesus is the International Harvester, and he will bring in every single harvest. He will not lose a soul. And so we're just faithful in the work, and that's why I wear the hat. And I get a lot of comments on the hat everywhere I go. By the way, if you wear an International Harvester hat, particularly, you get an instant cred when you walk into co-op. If you wear a John Deere hat, they think you might have bought it at Walmart. But if you wear an International Harvester hat, you've had intentionality, right? Or Massey Ferguson. Wear an more obscure tractor hat and know something about the brand, and you're in. That's it. So everywhere I go, it's like, oh, you're an International guy. I used to drive a Scout. I said, yeah, I love International. We'll talk a little bit, and then I can tell them about Jesus. But that's what I would just say. It's like farming, but at the end of the day, you don't make the crops grow. And just let God do his work, and you do your work. And I really want to agree with Steve, man. Find some other men. The primary problem in rural work is isolation, and that you can overcome that. You can overcome it on Zoom. You can overcome it on the telephone. You can certainly drive to the next county, but it's important. It's incredibly important. And Satan doesn't want you to interact with others, and he'll put everything in your path to keep that from happening.
That's good. I thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining us today and taking the time out. I'm glad you're able to do this. It's going to be on YouTube later, and the resources and links and all that stuff. And thanks to everyone who is putting a focus on rural ministry. Steve, I'm going to ask you to close us with prayer. Pray for rural pastors and churches, and then we'll be done.
Love to. Father, we thank you for this time. We do. I love those words Mark just spoke, that we are doing this to display your worth because you are infinitely precious. We matter because we're made in your image, but you are the great God. None of us is, and none of us aspires to be. We want to make much of you. We want to celebrate you. And we know that that the direction this universe is going is that one day your glory will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. And you are to be praised in every place, big and small, and everywhere in between. So Lord, I pray for those on this call now, those who will watch it later, that you will encourage us and help us by your Holy Spirit to press on with courage and good cheer and humility and doggedness, tenacity in the ministry you've called us to. We pray for your name's sake. Amen.
Thanks so much for everybody for joining in today. Thanks to these men. We'll post this online later. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Who do we look to shape our world? It'll be people who know how to think with their heads and their hearts. People who understand that faith is not the enemy of education, but its partner. More than book smart, more than business smart, they're wise in their whole being.
We are future shapers.
Learn to live well and lead well in God's world. Be a future shaper at OBU.